Nigeria took the global stage at the 80th United Nations General Assembly in New York, where Vice President Kashim Shettima delivered a national statement on behalf of President Bola Ahmed Tinubu under the theme, Better Together, 80 Years and More for Peace, Development and Human Rights. Nigeria reaffirmed its commitment to multilateralism, peace, development and human rights. The statement called for urgent UN reforms, including a permanent Security Council seat for Nigeria, and highlighted 4 global priorities: Security Council reform, debt relief and fair financing, equitable mineral resources and the benefit of equitable mineral resources, and digital inclusion, with AI standing for Africa included. President Tinubu also backed a 2-state solution in Palestine and called for global cooperation, stating that none of us is safe until all of us are safe. This is Focus on Nigeria today. Thanks for joining us. I am Eukaria Clinton. With me in the studio for the conversation is the former ambassador of Nigeria to Pakistan, Dawuda Danladi. It's a pleasure to have you in Nigeria today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Also joining us via Zoom is a professor of international relations and a directing staff at the National Institute for Security Studies, Abuja, Mukhtar Imam. It's a pleasure to have you on Nigeria today.
My pleasure. Good evening.
Now, I'll start with you, Ambassador Danladi. Talk to us. What stood out for you most from the president's speech as delivered by the vice president?
Well, I think the vice president eloquently delivered the speech of President Ahmed Tinubu to this world global gathering of leaders. And I think it's from the speech, it's very clear that Nigeria has shifted from development diplomacy to moral diplomacy. The vice president's speech equally emphasized and strongly called for a collective global approach towards addressing the various challenges that has developed and bedeviled the world. And again, that speech, President Bola has really positioned Nigeria as a conscious voice for the global South, reaffirming Nigeria's strong position in the continent, the quest for a seat in the UN Permanent Security Council. You can see that about 142 countries have endorsed the state of Palestine, but because of veto power of the United States and other countries like Germany, Italy, Japan, South Korea, that have really not endorsed the Palestine. So it's not binding. It is an endorsement, but it is not binding because of what? Because of veto power. Suppose that Nigeria was there and that seat, it could perhaps tilt. He has called for reform of the entire United Nations because for over 80 years of the existence of the United Nations, today in the 21st century, look at the global crisis in terms of conflicts around the world that the world is facing. The Ukraine-Russia war, over 62,000 people have lost their lives. They have spent about almost 400, the Western countries, $420 billion US to prosecute that particular war. Imagine what that money would have done in addressing climate change, especially developing countries. Again, if you go further, looking at the human catastrophe in Gaza, and I think Nigeria family is committed to see that peace and security is restored in Gaza. And going further, the speech actually addressed the need to close the gap, the digital gap, technology, so that Africa, there will be an inclusion, and Africa can also participate and benefit in the the digital global world. Finally, to give you a little break, is the fact that
Okay.
the speech addressed the issue of debts. You see, developing countries are spending close to about 70% of their revenue in servicing external debts. If there is a reduction, there is a debt relief, it would promote trade and investment in African countries, at the same time create the necessary jobs, right? And finally, the issue of resource control, sharing. Our resources in Africa should not be exploited without benefit accruing to the African countries in terms of partnership, in terms of investment, in terms of local processing of these resources. So the speech really positioned Nigeria as a voice for the global south and calls for reformation, institutional reformation of the international order. It calls for the promotion of multilateralism.
I'll have to stop you
Okay,
here,
thank you very much.
Ambassador Danladi, and let's hear from Professor Imam. Now, Professor Ambassador Danladi, of course, in his opening remark, talked about the call for a permanent Security Council seat for Nigeria. Now, in your own opinion, how strong is this demand, and what are the global implications of this call?
Thank you very much. First of all, congratulations to the world for ensuring that the United Nations survived for 80 years. And congratulations to the Vice President for a very profound remark, or speech rather, delivered at the United Nations General Assembly on behalf of not just Nigeria and the continent, but on behalf of humanity. His speech was very profound, it was prolific, and it spoke to very critical issues at a time where the world is faced, or rather at a time where the world is at a crossroad. As far as the request or the prayers of the president via his vice president to the United Nations General Assembly, Nigeria has been a leading voice in the campaign for seats at that very august table. The United Nations Security Council is the highest Security Council, the highest decision-making body, period, in the world. And so for a continent of 50+ countries, for a continent that houses 60% of the world's arable land, for a continent that houses between 60 and 70% of the world's rare earth, for a continent that has, this very strategic posture which Africa has. And when we talk about Africa, we must recognize the place of Nigeria, because 1 out of every 4 African is a Nigerian. So therefore, if there are any measures or metrics or indices to be checked or boxes to be ticked for our place or placement around the table of the Security Council, I think we have ticked or checked virtually all of these boxes. And so there's a need for reconsideration, there's a need for restructuring. Under Ambassador or Professor Gambari, efforts were made. And I think the Abuja Declaration under Brutus Ghali spoke to Nigeria's constant nagging and need and request for a place around the Security Council. So I think as far as demands are concerned, demands have been made. It is high time that the August body begins to have a rethink around the composition of particularly the Security Council and the entire General Assembly itself. Because the reality is, with what we are witnessing today, there's the need for not just the restructuring of the Security Council, but to ensure that the rotationing of the General Assembly commences as well. Because imagine what we saw, that the President of the United States will use his power unilaterally to disallow a sitting leader of the Palestinian state to attend this very important occasion at a time where 149 countries are endorsing the statehood of the Palestinian people, which, by the way, is long overdue, because this is a global consensus that is enshrined in the United Nations General Assembly itself. Resolution 242 and 181 speak to the need to return to the pre-1967 border It speaks to the need to the existence of the state of Israel and the state of Palestine unequivocally, living side by side one another, which is essentially the two-state solution. And, at a time, at this very pivotal moment, for the president of Palestine to be disallowed from coming into New York to attend this very important occasion, this is literally spitting on the headquarter agreement. And that shouldn't be condoned, because the world, if anything, at this point, needs multilateralism. If Trump is going to be an ultra-nationalist figure who is saying America first, we have no problems with that. But ensure that while saying America first, you also give other countries the liberty to choose their friends, to take whatever posture they intend to take within the international system. You cannot be a one-man police and continue to exert yourself as the world's economic policeman, as the world, whatever other policeman. It is not appropriate. So, well, to your question, I think it is long overdue that a restructuring happens around the Security Council to allow for countries, particularly on the African continent, to find a seating around that table.
Thank you very much, Professor Imam. Back to you, Ambassador Danladi. Of course, we've heard what Professor Imam, his submissions then. Now, looking at the speech, President Tinubu outlined 4 key points, including debt relief and digital inclusion. And of course, you talked about the resource control, or the what is termed equitable mineral resources, which of course you mentioned earlier on that Africa is blessed with. Now, looking at all these key highlights, which of them do you think, as a matter of urgency, we need to prioritize? We need to, put at the top of our list?
Well, almost all. You see, when you look at mineral resources, Africa houses over 65% of all non-proven mineral resources in the world. The move towards clean energy, to a large extent, will depend on Africa, because lithium is one of the main drivers towards the achievement of clean energy. If you look at the debt shackle, it has to a large extent contributed to underdevelopment of African countries, where these countries spend chunk of their revenue to service debt at the expense of provision of good quality of education, health, other social amenities, creating the necessary job to keep the youth engaged. I think to a large extent, there is an urgent need, 1, for debt servicing, 2, debt relief, 3, to address climate changes. You can see how African countries have suffered the consequences of climate change in terms of floods. Presently, right now in Nigeria, you can see that most of the states have suffered flood disasters, even though the Nigerian government and the National Emergency Management Service has been on top of the challenges, but still that is one good area. Desertification, it's capital intensive to control the desert. And Western countries have pledged the sum of $100 billion annually to address climate change, to provide resilient strategies that African countries can mitigate the effect of climate change. So, in a nutshell, I think this speech is a wake-up call, and I think it has resonated very well in the United Nations. It has positioned Nigeria, as I said, to be the conscience, actually, of the Global South in calling for a multilateral approach that will address the various challenges that has bedeviled the world.
Thank you. We are going to take a short break now. The conversation will continue after the break. Don't go away.
The implementation of the ruling is also dependent on another aspect or another arm of government.
Nowhere in the world will allow, under digital economy, for banks not to be dispensing domestic currency in that economy.
What will make this one different?
We want to know what they do as occupation. All of these are attributes that our questions have been designed to investigate.
In a few days to come, you see that we are all around their own crannies and everywhere in Nigeria, telling people to cooperate.
Welcome to Nigeria Today. Welcome back. This is your Nigeria Today, and we are looking at the President Tinubu'S speech at the 80th Unga. And I have two gentlemen, one via Zoom and one here in the studio. So, Professor Imam, now, earlier on we talked about equitable mineral resources. We're calling for, you know, well, like Ambassador Danladi mentioned, a fair deal. Now, I come to think of it, is it not funny that we are calling for equitable mineral resources for the, would I say, the mineral resources that are domiciled here in Africa? So what then is the role of African in resource control? Okay, you had, of course, the question I threw there. So it's kind of worrisome.
Yeah, well, you see, when you're talking about resources, yes, there is the capital resources, the human resources. Okay, now we are looking at the mineral resources. That exploitation and exploration of mineral resources is capital intensive. In Nigeria here, just look at bitumen. We have over 17 billion cubic feet of bitumen. All right? To explore that is capital intensive. At the artisanal level, it's not enough. And when these multinational companies come in to exploit these resources, we are looking at the sharing formula. Is it beneficial to the host countries? This is the question. Look at what has happened in Niger. You know, following the push in Niger, and look at how the uranium prices have gone up, and look at what Niger is now getting. If you go to Burkina Faso, it's the same story. You go to most of the southern countries, it's the same story. The DRC, for example, houses almost 60% of proven mineral resources. But look at what is happening in the DRC. Conflict, wars, and is there equitable sharing of these resources? No. What is happening in Sudan? Well, it could be tied to the exploration of mineral resources in South Sudan, where you now have two varying camps, the West and the East, all struggling for the mineral resources in Sudan. So the issue is, yes, these mineral resources are with us, but we want partnership, we want collaboration, we want investment to add value, local processing that will create jobs. This is what I think President Bola Tinubu, this was the message to the United Nations General Assembly, the 80th.
Okay, now, okay, we are yet to get the professor back. Now, the statement highlighted Nigeria's role in peacekeeping and fighting terrorism. How important is this role on the global stage?
And that is why Nigeria, we are demanding, and I think President Bola is right, to firmly and strongly call for the reformation of the UN Security Council. Remember, Nigeria was a frontline state in the quest for the independence of Southern African countries. I'm talking about Angola, Namibia, Mozambique, South Africa itself. Nigeria contributed both human and material resources towards the liberation of Southern Africa. If you come to the West African region, remember, Nigeria was the promoter, was the financier of the ECOMOG to restore peace in Liberia and Sierra Leone. We have lost over 500 good souls in order to restore peace, apart from the huge investment the Nigerian government have made. Nigeria has played key role in ensuring peace and stability within the African region, which is admirable, and it has been recognized at international. So we demand, and I think it is apt, and this is the right time, that Nigeria should be made a permanent member of the UN Security Council to represent the African continent, to have veto power on behalf of 1.4 billion people.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Now, Professor Imam, can you hear me? Now, of course, earlier on, you talked quite a lot about, there were issues here you raised them. However, what are the economic dimensions of the president's call? Because he called for multilateral reforms and technological equity. What are the economic dimensions of these these key points that was raised during the 80th Unga?
Well, part of the things that the vice president, the president of Nigeria, essentially talked about that basically affects, economy, has to do with debt relief. It has to do with ensuring that Nigeria has access to international resources, or rather the equitable distribution of resources within the international system. It had to do with debt cancellation. It had to do with access to markets, and so on and so forth. These are essentially things that affects us directly and indirectly as far as the economy is concerned. Essentially, the message that the president or Nigeria is trying to pass to that August body is that there's the need to ensure that the global north begins to find a way of, settling down some of the debts which the continent of Africa, again, like I said, the vice president did not just speak for Nigeria, he spoke for the continent and, of course, for the entire black race, is to ensure that these debts are reconsidered, because there's a need to begin to have a rethink around debt. There's the need to have, a conversation that is realistic around what we owe and what should be paid. Because these are very, very important steps. If we do not have realistic conversations around that, if we do not look at the current international economic system to find a footing for ourselves, then we will continue to play second fiddle. Because it appears that the international economic system is hijacked by an oligarchic structure, which is controlled and dominated by the petrodollar. And so what we're saying is allow for equitability, allow us to meet you as kings meeting kings, so that we can have a rational conversation, not one that is dominated by one side of the divide. And so this is the message that the Nigerian government is essentially trying to pass through that August body to the global north, so that way we have some sort of balanced, economic relation between developing countries and the developed countries. But beyond the economy, the message that the vice president took to Unga was essentially about humanity first and foremost. He moved away sharply from economic diplomacy to talk about moral diplomacy, to talk about the conscience of the world, to talk about the need to stop the genocide which has consistently taken lives of women, children, and men in Palestine. The need to ensure that global consensus, when adopted, is respected, because without that, we are literally nothing. And so when countries come up with postures and position that will, that places them on a certain pedestal and alienates the rest of the world, it's not very good for diplomacy. And these are part of the things that the vice president was trying to send, or the signal, the message that the vice president was trying to send to the rest of the world.
Thank you very much, Professor Mokhtar Imam, the Professor of International Relations and Director Staff at the National Institute for Security Studies, Abuja. Thank you so much for coming on the program. And Ambassador Dauda Danladi, former ambassador to Nigeria, of Nigeria to Pakistan. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you very much for having me.
Sharing your thoughts with us.
Thank you.
Thank you for being part of the program. I'm Victoria Clinton. Goodbye.